Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best legendary cards to craft for Wild format. That's right, Wild format. Now, I don't usually do Wild format videos, but I'd like to start doing a few more of them now and again, and since the Wild Fest is here and there's about to be some Wild format constructed play in my near future, I wanted to dive deeper into the best Wild cards to have, not only for myself, but for all of you guys out there as well. So this video will essentially help you make some crafting decisions for the strongest, most reliable, most consistent cards in Wild format. In other words, the cards that will help you build a really strong foundation for your collection if you're looking to play Wild for the foreseeable future. You can't go wrong with crafting these cards. I've tried to future-proof this video as much as possible. All these cards, of course, are going to be in Wild forever because that's how it works, as far as we know anyway, for the presumable future. But also, of course, they're strong right now. So they're not just cards that I think will be good. They're really good right now, important in the meta right now, and they have the ability to last for a really long time. They're just fundamentally sound and seem like they're always going to be good in Hearthstone. Now, that said, for this video, I did emphasize neutral cards because I think neutral cards go a lot farther for a collection building process than do class cards. At any given point in any given Hearthstone meta, there are some class legendary cards that are going to be defining the best cards in the set. And for this video, I did leave some of those out right now. And in fact, I wanted to, honorably mention a few. So class cards that are great right now that didn't make the cut for this video are things like Blood Reaver Gul'dan, Mal'Ganis, Malfurion the Pestilent, the Death Knight, Sunkeeper Tarim for Paladin, and even Alaneth for Mage right now is doing some crazy work in Wild format. So those are just a handful, I think 5 cards that if you're really looking to play any of those classes, certainly those will go a long way. It seems like they'll be good for their respective classes forever, for at least a really, really, really long time. But they didn't make the video again because I do think neutral cards, on average, are a better way to spend your dust, particularly if you're a new or growing Hearthstone player, particularly in Wild format. So, all of that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list, the 10 best Wild legendary cards to craft. Up first at the number 10 spot here, I have Blood Mage Thranos. Now in my standard format crafting guide videos, Blood Mage Thranos always ranks really near the top of the list, but in Wild format there's so many different good legendaries available that Blood Mage Thranos just barely makes the cut. And that's really, of course, because classic cards in Wild format don't really get any boost for longevity. Any card in any given set is going to last forever, so classic cards are no different than anything else. So Thranos doesn't get that sort of classic card boost that we normally talk about. That said, still a great card for Wild format because of its flexibility. Blood Mage Thranos is really just one of those jack-of-all-trades cards you can put into so many different decks and so many different archetypes because it does a couple different things. Sometimes it's that spell damage piece for board clears or just burst damage. Sometimes it's a Death Rattle synergy card that just cycles, and its low cost, of course, means it's super flexible in accomplishing all of those different goals. So a very low risk sort of card with a bevy of rewards essentially across so many different classes. Seems like it's going to be one of those cards that just fits into so many different styles and metas that you can't go wrong having it in your collection. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have Bronzebeard, a personal favorite. Looks a bit like me, I have to say. Maybe he's got a better mustache, who knows. I certainly don't have a hat that cool, but nonetheless, Bronzebeard's a fantastic card to have in your Wild collection because, of course, his effect is just absolutely bonkers. Battle Cries are some of the most defining cards in Hearthstone, and Bronzebeard can make so many of them do completely ridiculous, crazy, over-the-top things. This card can just give your deck so much extra depth and power and raw reach that no other card can provide. And again, it's one of those flexible, low-cost cards that so many different decks, from aggressive decks to control decks, can still find ways to utilize this one. So believe it or not, he's only number 9 on this list, but Bronzebeard is a fantastic card to have around. Moving on to the number 8 spot here, I have Leroy Jenkins, another card that ranks really high on my standard format list, but it's a little bit lower in Wild format. That said, Leroy is still a fantastic burst finisher option, even in Wild format. Every aggressive deck that really wants to kill their opponent needs some way to find some damage to do that, and for many decks and classes, Leroy Jenkins still meets that need. And in Wild format, of course, there are a lot of crazy combo potentials that Leroy Jenkins can enable as well when you combine it with cost discounts from things like Emperor Thorson. The potential is essentially limitless. Leroy can go crazy. So whether he's just that consistent 6 damage from hand, whether he's part of some silly combo, Leroy remains one of the most consistent and most efficient single target high burst damage cards in the game, and that's why he's carved out a spot on this list. Up next at the number 7 spot here, we have the Lich King, and that's because basically so many different control or value-oriented decks need a big threat like the Lich King that's just a scary thing to play on board, has some defensive potential, but also can generate an absurd amount of value. And because Lich King is generating cards every turn, and often very powerful swingy style cards at that, he's a great asset for control decks to play. Alongside things like Ysera, Lich King is just one of those value bomb cards that tons of different decks like to run. And on top of that, you can even see Lich King sometimes as like the top end in a mid-range style deck as well, where they're just looking for that one big final threat, that finisher piece of the puzzle that can help them overwhelm their opponent with pressure as they start to run out of gas. Lich King can sort of reignite that fuel and give them the reach and the push they need to actually win the game. So a surprisingly flexible card for an 8-mana card because it can fit into a couple different primary archetypes, and a card that's certainly a great piece to have in your collection, and a cool card for Warcraft nerds out there too, because of course Lich King is really the big bad in Warcraft. So it's cool to have him be such an important part of your deck and your collection. And moving on to the number 6 spot, speaking of big value bomb style cards that are 8-mana 8/8s, on top of Lich King, there's also Ragnaros. And basically everything I said about Lich King, you can also say the exact same thing about Ragnaros. He's just one of those big high pressure late game minions that's great in control decks, but can also fit in slightly more aggressive decks as well, because 8 damage every turn can apply a ton of pressure. It can often be controlled so that it hits your opponent's face for just 8 damage burst as well. And this is another one of those cards that if your opponent just doesn't immediately address it, it starts to snowball into so much value that it's almost inevitable that it can win you games. And Ragnaros is basically the old school version of what the Lich King has been lately in standard format, but in Wild, you can even run both sometimes for the super greedy style decks. But picking one or the other, they both serve the same kind of need. Having both is fine too. Some decks can utilize one better than the other, just depending on what they're trying to accomplish. But essentially, they're both fantastic 8-mana 8/8s, and Ragnaros, as the OG 8-mana 8/8 value bomb, I think is slightly better than the Lich King still, just because he makes a more instant and direct impact on the board most of the time. And I really like to see that. And of course, I'm just a big fan of Ragnaros. He's given me a lot of good 50/50s back in the day, so a great card to have in your Wild format collection. As we move into the top 5 here, we have Reno Jackson at the number 5 spot. And of course, Reno is a card that carved out his own archetype completely, starting the Reno style carried on by Kazakis lately, and who knows what it'll be once Kazakis rotates out of standard format. But in Wild format, guess what? You get to play with all those things forever. So Reno as an archetype seems like it could be the sort of thing that lasts virtually forever. It certainly has a lot of longevity because Reno Jackson is one of the best healing style cards in the game, and frankly Wild format has so many different resources for every given class that building a Reno Jackson style deck at this point really isn't even compromising the quality of your deck all that often, and that's why this is still a card to this day you see really often in Wild. And it can be a game-ending, game-breaking, game-winning kind of play on turn 6, but it's great in all kinds of slower decks that are just looking to gain some edge of survivability. So Reno, I think, will continue to define an archetype in Hearthstone for a very long time to come, and that's why he's such an important card to craft. Moving on to the number 4 spot here, we have another 6-mana card. This time around, it's Emperor Thorson, and this, of course, is another one of those cards that's just so strong, you can't afford not to have it. The cost reduction that Emperor can provide is so enormous. It's good in all kinds of different decks. Not only can it set up silly combos that would otherwise be impossible without it, but it's just great to reduce a handful of cards. That much mana discount, that much tempo advantage can provide some huge swings in all kinds of different decks, whether they're mid-rangey or control. Emperor Thorson is often a great fit just because the stats are good for the cost. It's one of those mid-range minions that's just hard to deal with. It creates an impossible situation for your opponent where they absolutely have to kill it, because if it goes off for a turn or two, it's clearly going to be a game-deciding kind of play. And when a card is that good proactively, it's that much friction creating for your opponent. That's a really good card to have around. And of course, this also empowers a lot of different decks and combos directly. So a distinctly important and incredibly powerful card to have in your set. And in fact, the number 3 spot is a card that's really quite similar in a lot of ways to Emperor Thorson. It's just one of those general use cards that's fantastic across so many different decks. The effect is incredibly strong. Increasing the cost of your opponent's spells creates so much friction for them. It's something that's almost impossible to overcome. So Lotheb can basically be used in a couple different ways. In aggressive decks, you can build a giant board of stuff. You can follow it up with Lotheb to deny your opponent's ability to actually deal with your board. They can't cast big AoE spells because Lotheb simply makes them too expensive. And then even in slower decks, you can use Lotheb essentially to deny your opponent's ability to deal damage. You can prevent them from casting multiple fireballs at your face, buying yourself some time or a stall or an extra turn or two to find your own lethal or set up some sort of counter or find the Reno heal. So Lotheb, just as a 5-mana minion, he's that perfect sweet spot for fast decks, for slow decks. They can both fit him in. He's really quite flexible to play too. At 5 mana, you can often play him with multiple other cards. So he enables so many different sorts of things. And he's also, I would say, one of the most strategically interesting cards in Hearthstone, because when you decide to play Lotheb can really determine just how powerful he is. So he's a good card for players to learn to utilize and really start to understand the importance of individual turns in Hearthstone, which can make or break a victory very often, and not everybody realizes. So essentially a very powerful card to have, but also a great learning experience. Lotheb is maybe my favorite card of all time in Hearthstone when I really start to think about it, just because I like how balanced it is, how interesting and interactive it is. Lotheb is a fantastic card. I almost wish he was number 1 on this list, but frankly there are a couple cards that see more play and have a bigger impact even than Lotheb in wild formats. Speaking of cards that have a big impact in wild format, this is N'Zoth, the Corruptor, the number 2 card on my list. And frankly, there's a pretty strong argument that this should be the number 1 card on the list, because N'Zoth is the second most played card in all of wild format today. He's in nearly 17% of decks. The only thing that beats that is Blood Reaver Gul'dan because of Warlock's popularity, but of course a vast majority of Blood Reaver decks are also running N'Zoth, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I'm not including class cards in this list because I think neutral cards are just so much better at building a varied collection for most players. So N'Zoth takes the number 2 spot, and simply number 2 because of the fact that N'Zoth does require you often to have a lot of other stuff to make it work. So this card is a little bit dependent on the rest of your collection. It's not the sort of thing you can just slot into any deck and get some utility out of it. So for new players in particular who maybe don't have a ton of Death Rattle minions, this one could be a little bit riskier to craft. It's still certainly a goal, and of course N'Zoth is an incredibly powerful turn in wild format. There are so many good Death Rattle minions, including the one we're going to see at the number 1 spot, that often playing N'Zoth is a game-ending sort of play a lot of the time, or at least such a value bomb that your opponent never really recovers if it doesn't just immediately force the concede or give you some sort of lethal setup in the next turn. This card will undoubtedly take you a really, really, really long way across a variety of decks in wild format. It's, of course, Control Warlock right now, but it might be 1,000 other things in the future because Death Rattle is such an important keyword in Hearthstone, and there are so many other great Death Rattle cards always being added to the game and those that already exist that N'Zoth is not ever going to go away. He's always going to be one of the ultimate finisher style cards in Hearthstone as far as I can tell, and that's why he's such a good card for you to own. But there's one more card I think is even better, and that is Sylvanas Windrunner. I think throughout the history of Hearthstone, this has been one of the most played, most recognized, most beloved, and most crafted cards in all of the game, because for everything I said about Lotheb and Emperor Thorson and all these other cards like Lich King and Ragnaros as sort of the go-to value bomb cards that are just good to fit in so many different kinds of decks, Sylvanas takes that and she takes it to another level. She's just absolutely perfect for that style of play. It feels like you can just toss her in anytime you need a 6-mana card she's fantastic. So she can work not necessarily in super aggressive decks, but certainly in mid-rangey decks, control decks, she's fantastic. She's another one of those cards that creates so much friction for your opponent. It's often impossible to deal with cleanly. She has synergies, of course, with tons of death rattle cards like N'Zoth at the number 2 spot. And even though she doesn't get played quite as much as N'Zoth, she's only in 14% of wild format decks right now. She's much better for a new and growing player because you can just toss her into decks and you know she's going to do something positive. You know she's going to add some value to your play. Unlike N'Zoth, which requires you to build some synergy pieces, Sylvanas is just a good one of. She's the ultimate go-to, just drop this thing in and feel like you're going to accomplish something. It's always a great draw and a great play when you can slam Sylvanas. You know you're going to get something in return, and that to me is why she's still the best card to craft in wild format today. And there you have it, folks. Those are my 10 best legendary cards to craft in wild format Hearthstone. Now, I'm sure some of you out there will have some insights into this list, reasons you agree, disagree, reasons you think the ranking should be different. Hey, please share those in the comments below. I want to hear that stuff too. I like to hear what you guys have to say. You provide some really valuable insights on top of my own. I don't get everything right. Anybody watching this video should read the comments too to see what other people say. Get a second opinion on top of mine. That'll help confirm your theories or suspicions or doubts. You can learn so much more than just watching me from also reading the comments. All that said, everybody, thank you for watching. And until next time, game on.